Module 4, Monitoring and Evaluation. This module distinguishes between program monitoring and evaluation. It details on summative and formative evaluation methods should be employed and identifies the information sources relevant to program monitoring. The rationale for undertaking evaluations is presented, and guidance for establishing practical evaluation is provided. Mr. Taylor will start Module 4.
The first thing I'm going to talk to you about is how to evaluate and monitor community programs. Now, I know you've had some detailed information about monitoring and evaluation earlier in your program. This is a little bit different because of the nature of community programs. Community programs are small, are localised, and that means the evaluation needs to be small and localised. And I will explain how we can do that for community programs. And the first question for us is, why do we evaluate? Certainly the first thing is we need to know if something worked. And that's why we evaluate. Secondly, we also need to be able to justify the use of our public money. It's usually the money of the community that we use in road safety programs, and we need to justify that. We also need to see if we've got any improvement over time. What's the progression of trends? Have we improved over time or not in the behaviours that we are trying to identify? A further reason for evaluation is if something didn't work, we need to know why. If we know why, we can avoid that problem the next time we do a similar type of program. And we also need to provide information to build upon for a better future program. If we do one phase 1 year, we know that we haven't solved the problem of behaviours. We'll need to do a second phase the second year. Can we make that better? And the only reason we can make it better is if we have evaluation. Finally, and just as importantly, remember a community program operates with the assistance of a wide range of agencies and people, some of them providing volunteer assistance. We need to provide feedback to them about how things worked. We won't know how things worked unless we have an evaluation. So that's another reason for an evaluation of a community program. The first step in any evaluation is the objectives. I've been hammering you about objectives, but I don't resile from doing that. It is the most important thing. For community programs in detail, there are 3 levels of objectives you might want to consider. And the first is what I call the ultimate level, the outcome of the program as a whole. And that's usually the assessment of crashes on the road or injuries resulting from crashes on the road. That ultimate objective you should include in your program, but you wouldn't measure the success of the program solely on the basis of injury and crash reduction. I mentioned that yesterday, and that's because programs are small and you may not be able to detect any change. So you still need to say, this is what we're trying to do ultimately, that's our ultimate objective, but don't measure the success of the program entirely on that basis. The second level are intermediate or behavioural objectives, and this should be the core of your objectives. What behaviours are we going to change? And I've got some examples there. The change in the number of drivers who report driving over the legal limit. That's a self-reported behaviour, but it's still a useful one. We know when people self-report, they exaggerate how good they are. So we wouldn't use that measure on its own, but it's a useful one. The change in the number of drivers who report planning not to drink and drive after social occasions. That's also a self-reported one. But you might also have another behavioural objective, which is the change in the proportion of drivers who are over the legal limit detected at a random stopping site by police. That is an observed behaviour. You can observe that, you can detect it at random sites, and you can identify the difference between what was before the program and what was after it. It's just counting. You're just counting the number of people who you have detected that are over the legal limit. Behavioural objectives for all of your programs should be the key. Takes a little bit of thinking about how you can measure them and what's the way of doing it, but they're the key. Now, the third level of objectives are what I call operational. These are objectives where you are trying to make sure that the program that you have designed has actually been put into the field. That the timing of initiatives, the scale of them, and when and where they were proposed to be undertaken actually were undertaken at that time. Sometimes programs fail not because they're the wrong idea or because the design was bad, it was just that we didn't put them into place at the right time. And so we need an operational objectives. Now here are some examples. If we had police enforcement as part of the program, then the number of enforcement hours devoted to the program would be a measure of operational. Police might say we're going to do 200 hours. The question is, did they do 200 hours? That's an operational behavioural objective which we can measure. The change in the driver's perceptions of the chances of being caught over the legal limit. That's an attitudinal objective. What have drivers changed in their attitude having been subjected to the program? Has their attitude to the chances of being detected changed? That's another behavioural objective. Shouldn't be in that one. So there's three levels of objectives. Before we actually look at evaluation in detail, just one slide on project monitoring. Behaviour is where you are identifying an actual physical activity and you are measuring a change from one point to the other. Behavioural objective might be the number of people who are over the legal limit, or the number of people who don't wear a motorcycle helmet, or the number of people who cross the road without looking, or the number of people who don't use the pedestrian crossing when it's there, or the number of drivers who ignore a red light. That's behavioural. You can measure the behaviour. Attitudinal is where you are measuring a person's belief about something, and they can be measured as well. Like an attitude might be, what's the attitude of the majority of the population to police enforcement? Do they agree with it or do they not? You do a survey, let's say when you start 20% agree with it, when you finish 50% agree with it. There's been a change in attitude of the number of people who agree with enforcement being a good thing. That's one example. An attitude to the wearing of seatbelts. You might want to measure how many people think it is a good thing to wear seatbelts or a safe thing to wear seatbelts. You ask them that question, they come back, and you find out that, I don't know, 60% of people at the start think seatbelts are a good thing to wear, and at the finish of your program, 80%. You've had a change in the attitude. In that case, you're not measuring whether they actually wear it or not, that's the behaviour. You're measuring their attitude to the wearing of seatbelts. How's that, Daisy?
Yes, thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. Now, a little bit about project monitoring. Project monitoring is a little bit different from evaluation. Project monitoring is when you're actually running a project. You've got it in the field, it's running. The enforcement's there, the advertising's there, the educational components, whatever you're doing in the school is in operation. You want to know whether the project's progressing, whether it's progressing as you planned, and that's called project monitoring. And you take information from the field of the project every day, really, about how it's progressing. And if you think that some of that information is leading you to believe the project is not progressing as you like, you change it in midstream. You change it 1 week after the next to do what you want. And the only way you know whether the project's operating is if you can project monitor. Now, project monitoring can use some hard data, but it can also use just anecdotal information. That's quite okay because it gives you a feel about what's happening. And you need that information. It is different from hard evaluation, but you use project monitoring to help improve the program. Some of the data I've got here, that you can use the enforcement data from police, the hours of operation, the number of offences, the areas where they've taken their activity. Has this been in accord with the program? Is it progressing as you want? If it's not, you talk to the police. Say, can we get this back on track? You can get information on how the audience feels about messages that you may have presented in your educational or your campaigns. Audience feedback. The feedback can be through letters to the editor, radio talkback. You can even talk to people on the street. What do they think about things? Have they heard of the program? Have they heard of the message that you're presenting? If nobody's heard about it, you've got to start wondering what's happening to our information flow. Also, message understanding. You might have a message that says we want people to wear motorcycle helmets. When you go and talk to some people in the street or get some feedback, perhaps the feedback is that the campaign's all about repairing your motorcycle. Well, that's not what you wanted them to understand. You wanted them to wear helmets. So there's something happening in the program where the message is not being heard. Those are the sorts of things that you would monitor with program monitoring. You can take that information from crash and injury trends, you just monitor it as it goes. You can take that from word of mouth, radio talkback, letters to the editor, media commentary, police feedback, even what shopkeepers say. Nothing wrong with all of that information as the program is progressing. It's not hard data, and it's not the data that you would use in that form for the evaluation, but it does help you with your monitoring. So that's project monitoring. What's evaluation? It's undertaken at the beginning and the end of the program, not just at the end. If you don't do some evaluation measures at the beginning, you can't do it at the end. Obviously, you want to know if the program's successful. It's got to be guided by the objectives, and the data you collect has to link directly to your objectives. So if you're measuring helmet wearing, don't collect data on how fast motorcyclists are riding. That doesn't meet the objectives of your particular program. Always collect the data according to the objectives. Project evaluation involves two types of data, qualitative and quantitative. Now, qualitative data is where you get information about what people think, what they believe, what their attitudes are, how they respond to the thinking. That's qualitative. It's their concerns, their prejudice, and their reasons for their behaviour. It's not numbers, it is feelings, emotions, thinking, and attitudes. That comes out of qualitative data. But you need qualitative data, particularly when you are running a program where you want to change the people's minds with an educational component. You need to know what motivates their thinking so you can attack that with a very good motivational piece of education. So you need qualitative data. The other sort of data is quantitative, and that's where you count. Quantitative means numbers, and that's directly related to the behaviour. It is the number and the proportion of the behaviours. How many people, what percentage of them did or didn't do what you wanted them to do. Difference between qualitative and quantitative, but both those two are important in an evaluation. I'll explain why in a moment. In addition to that, a good evaluation involves what I call three components or three types of evaluations. One is called formative, and formative, that's my word for it. Some people call it pre-program research, but formative means you are getting information at the start of the program that helps you design the program. And that's a formative piece of work. Another level of evaluation is called summative. Sometimes it's called outcome evaluation. Sometimes it's called impact evaluation. That's what we usually understand to be evaluation, where it's at the end of the program. Did it work? Did it not? Have we got measures that tell us that? So that's summative evaluation. And there's also process evaluation. And process evaluation is, let's look at the detail of what said we were going to do, and did we do what we said we were going to do when we were going to do it? So has the operation of the program been efficient and effective? It's the efficiency of operation in process evaluation. Here's how it appears in a diagram of evaluation. This is the formative evaluation. All the evaluations are in green. Formative over here at the start of the program, summative over here at the end, and process evaluation at the end. The formative evaluation is your pre-program information or your research. It's at the start. That informs the design of the program. It's usually done with market research skills. We'll talk about that in a moment. Once the program's in operation, you do your program monitoring, and out of the program monitoring you get data. You also get data from the formative program, and those forms of information or data are used in both the summative and the process evaluation. Think of the summative evaluation as, did it work? Think of the process evaluation of, did we do what we said we were going to do when we were going to do it? That's the best way to think about those forms of evaluation. When you read evaluation documentation, you won't get exactly my words. Some people will use different words, and I've tried to show you some of the words that they will use, but that's essentially the forms of evaluation. Let's have a look at formative evaluation. This is before the program starts. What do we do? Well, there's two forms of data that we might need, quantitative and qualitative. I've talked about those. If we want to get qualitative information, what are we trying to do? We're trying to identify the ideas, the thoughts, the views, the attitudes, the intentions and the feelings of the people that we're dealing with. And how do we get that? We might interview people. We might have focus groups. We might have mini groups, and we just talk to people. We talk to people about what they think about things, what their attitudes are, what their feeling is, and we collect that information. And that helps us design what the educative parts of the program ought to be. We also need to know how many people would believe these things. Is it important or not? There might be a viewpoint that says most people hate the police, but when you actually do some quantitative information, you find it's only 2 or 3. Well, it doesn't matter. The quantitative information here is how many people believe these behaviours you've identified or these views are important. If you find a lot of people believe they're important, then that's an important component for your project. How do you get the numbers of people that might think these things? Well, you do surveys, sample surveys, telephone surveys. Might not be so good in rural areas, but would probably be good in urban. You can do observation studies. You can set people on a street corner and see how many people wear their seatbelts. You need to know that before you start. And you can get enforcement data before the program. What have the police been doing and what's the level of speeding that they have found to date? That's all quantitative data that you can use at the start of the program. Then you start the program. Now, summative is where the program is finished and you have collected the data beforehand and you take measures of the same data afterwards and you are looking to identify whether it worked. There's 2 forms of data, scientific or quasi-scientific. I don't think we need to know that. When you had some information from Blair, he talked about a true scientific evaluation. That is never going to really happen in a local community program. So don't try and make an evaluation which is perfectly scientific where you have a control group and you control for every influence. You just can't do that with community programs. Too big, too hard. So it's usually a quasi-scientific method, and that's where you simply take measures beforehand and measures afterwards of key behaviours and you see if there's been a change. If there has been a change, you've got something happening. You may not be able to prove that your program was the thing that created the change, but you can get a fairly good idea that it has. You get information on the same things that you collected at the start of the program. Exactly the same. And that data is linked to the objectives. Here's an example of process evaluation. This is the programs in operation. What do? You collect information on the numbers or activities, the times of completion, what information was prepared and was it distributed to the organisations at the time, and was it distributed when we wanted to? What were the enforcement levels and were they undertaken at the same time? Did we put changes on the road environment? Were there new signs put in or something? And were they put in where we said they were going to be, and were they put in when we said they were going to be? Variations on some of these things will affect the efficiency of the program and may affect its operation. So you need to know whether the program actually did what you said it was going to do as a part of your evaluation. That's a little bit about quantitative and qualitative information. We've gone through the detail of that. Now, issues for evaluation. Firstly, the scientific. It is unlikely, as I said, for a community program to be able to have a scientific evaluation, and that means you really can't say that the program caused the effect that you are looking at. And the reason you can't say that is because there might be some other influences in the community that you're not able to control for that may or may not have had an effect on the program. That doesn't matter, but you have to accept the fact that a community program can't do that. And the reason why? Because they're small, the crash data, you can't detect a change. It's very difficult to get a suitable control group. If you want to compare with somebody who hasn't had the program, you have to look at a typical community, has the same sort of people, the same sort of area, the same part of the city, the same income levels and the same education levels. That's pretty hard to do that. You can't control for other influences that might have occurred during the program operation. You might have a program to do with, let's say, seatbelt wearing, and during the period of the seatbelt wearing program, there was a change in the legislation that required people to fit an entirely new seatbelt. Now that would throw out all of your measures because there would be a change in the program that would be occurring through the program that had nothing to do with your program. If scientific evaluations mean the project did or didn't reduce trauma, that's the outcome. However, for community programs, you use what I call this quasi-scientific approach. And the essence of that is you focus on behaviours, collect the data before and after, and you compare it with things that you have available. It might be national averages of seatbelt wearing. It might be the trends of seatbelt wearing that you have collected in the past. It could be what's the seatbelt wearing in another area of the city. You use comparisons with whatever is available. It's not perfect, but is a comparative analysis, and it helps identify any changes in your program. When you have completed the evaluation and you've got the data, here's how you describe the performance of your program. The project contributed to the observed effects on trauma, and it's indicative of success. Don't say it caused a success, because you'll get somebody who's got a lot of scientific knowledge who'll say, oh, it's not a scientific evaluation and it can't have cause and effect. Well, you know that. So don't say, yes, our project has caused this change. What you say is, on the basis of the information, we believe our project has shown success and there's successful trends in operation. Do you understand the distinction? And that's what you can do for community programs, because you can't have really a scientific evaluation for community programs. Now, just a few hints, finally a few hints if you're going to do an evaluation. Accept that you can't control all things. It's inevitable, so try to control what you can control. Have a good, design, and a good design means collecting data beforehand, doing some pre-program research, collecting data afterwards, and collecting it at the same times and in the same locations. Ensure that you measure behaviours, but there might also be knowledge or attitudes that you want to measure and collect information on that. Depends on the program. Sometimes some people don't do things because they don't know. And if your pre-program research says there's a large number of people who, don't know the law about drink driving, then part of your program should be designed to inform them as a first step. That's not sufficient for behaviour change, but if they don't know, then they can't do what you're asking them. So you might still have a knowledge objective in your behaviour. There's not too many knowledge objectives, but there probably will be some. And you should also try to control in your design for any obvious changes. Like, if you've got a program around schools, don't collect information during the school holidays. Okay? Or if you've got a program where you want to measure the community-wide influence of drink driving, don't just measure it outside drinking establishments, because that won't be representative of the community. It will be in fact, of the drinking community. So try to collect data to avoid those obvious things that might change. Don't collect data in the middle of a major festival, because that's unusual time and people will behave unusually, not normally in that situation. So that in your design, try and account for those major things, those things that you can control. Here's some hints. Take measures before and after we've talked. Interpret the outcomes as indicative, not actually cause and effect. Use local organisations and personnel, especially for data collection. And this is where there is a lot of resources in your communities at community level that are terrific. There are often colleges, there are often universities where students need to have some field experience. Get them involved. They love doing this sort of stuff. You can sit them on a street corner with a sheet and they can tick off the behaviours and you get the data. Even for some school programs, I've seen where senior elementary school students can be trained to collect information on what parents do at the school gate. Might be a bit tricky, but that's kids can do that. And they'll be very honest in their collection of information. And you can do that for both before and after. So evaluation doesn't have to be expensive. You don't have to commission a high quality, expensive, commercial evaluation firm to run community evaluations. Look at the resources you've got in the community. They're actually very good. You might need somebody skilled to provide training for some people, but that's all. It's not hard to do. If you want to measure seatbelt wearing, you get some teams out on the streets and you either stop them you either get them to look at where vehicles stop at traffic lights, where they can actually see who's wearing them and who's not, or you can put them at petrol stations. And when cars come into the petrol station, you can identify people wearing. It's very, very simple stuff, but it properly done, it is very powerful for explaining what you're doing and explaining the success of what you're doing. That's all I've got to tell you about evaluation, and I hope that wasn't too detailed, and I hope it was straightforward.